my name is Jessica Crow. I am the founder of Apogee, and this is the Change Leader Insights show. I'm so excited. Today, I have here with me Colonel Derek Oakes. He is an author, a keynote speaker, an entrepreneur, and a former fighter pilot and commander in the United States Air Force. He's currently the owner of Decisive Leadership LLC, which provides executive consulting, Department of Defense expertise, and keynote speeches and workshops. And he's also worked with numerous small businesses as an owner, consultant, COO, director, and subject matter expert. Wow. I'm so excited to have him here today because we are going to talk about how to create a culture of confident decision makers. But before that, Derek, can you please share with everybody who's watching and listening a little bit more about yourself, how you got to where you are today and your background and your story?
Sure, I'd love to. I was the fourth of six kids. My dad, from my earliest recollection, he was already a colonel in the Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
And he ended up rising to four-star general, and he was very interactive with us. He lived, breathed, and taught leadership and integrity and all the things that you would want out of a leader, in how he raised us. And so I watched him and I admired him and I wanted to be like him in a lot of ways. And then I joined the Air Force and I started watching other leaders, and some weren't as good, some were fantastic. So I am what I would call a student of leadership.
Yeah.
I look at what other people are doing. One of the things my dad said, many, many years ago is, as he's in a room, he always assumed there's somebody smarter than him. And so
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
makes you listen more, that makes you assume that somebody's going to say something that you can use later on. And so I've always done that. And I've always tried to, to learn from the people that I'm around, regardless of who they are. And so I spent, 25 years in the Air Force, and then got into small business after that, got into consulting, running a couple of businesses, starting a couple of businesses. And I've really enjoyed, kind of figuring out what works and
Yeah.
how to get something off the ground and how to move it forward and how to market it. But most
Yeah.
importantly, how to take a team and get that team to care about what you're doing, and how to get them to take ownership in what they're doing as part of that team.
Yeah. And we're going to get into that today. And one thing I should mention that's pretty cool. You've actually already written a book with your dad based on some of your leadership lessons being in the military. This one's called Rising Above. And I know you're working on a second book. So you've got a lot of perspective and ideas to help people who want to create those cultures of confident decision makers. So from your experience, what are some of the things that, if I'm in a leadership role, if people are listening who are in leadership roles, how do they do that? How do they create an environment where people feel like they can make decisions confidently without having, I'm guessing, to deal with some of the micromanagement that maybe, teams and leaders sometimes fall into that trap of doing?
Well, the first thing, and I really preach vision. The first thing that leader has to do is sit back and say, what are we about? What am I
Mm-hmm.
about? What matters to me? Where do I want to go? How do I envision myself, my organization, my team a week, 6 months, 10 years from now? And then once you do that, then you have to communicate that.
Mm-hmm.
Get the team on board with, excuse me, with where you want to go, and then you empower them with that vision. Once you've done that, once you've done your part communicate, then you empower them with that vision. What that means is that you give them a chunk of it, you make them responsible for that, and you don't get in their way. You don't try
Yeah.
to manage them. You don't, if they approach it a little bit differently than you don't nitpick them on the how to. You make sure you're focusing on the vision, on the objectives that are necessary to that vision, so that they can, in their own way, you know, make that vision their vision. And
Yeah.
'cause if they're just doing what you tell them to do, they're just doing your job.
Right. There's no
They're,
ownership
they're,
there.
they're just an extension of you, and they're waiting around to be told what to do. If you tell them where you want to go and they catch the vision of where you want to go, then they're going to think through the problem, and they're probably going to approach it a little bit differently. And you have to let
Yeah.
them approach it a little bit differently. You let them run with it. And sometimes they'll approach it differently, and it's not going to turn out well.
Right.
you can't crush them for that. You have to say, all right, how do we do on that? And that's where a solid, integrated debrief, um, where you're objective focused, not personality focused, you're objective focused, not technique focused, to then say, did that work? Yes or no? Partially. Let's figure out how we can do it better the next time. But they have to be in charge of that. They have to run that with your input and overall guidance so that then they come up with solutions. And it doesn't mean that,
Yeah.
because a lot of times the supervisor used to do the subordinate's job.
Right.
So you're going to have some good inputs. You're going to have some good ideas, but you have to let them get to it. You have to let them go through it and then, provide timely inputs so that those ideas become their ideas instead of just, listening to you.
Yeah. No, and this is such an important message. And I remember when you and I first met, the reason I really like what you have to say and why I think it's a really important message for people who are leading others and especially organizational change is because that vision piece, casting a vision, is so critical. And I think we in the workplace often underestimate the power of setting that vision and then letting the teams, to your point, take ownership of it and make it their own. And that's a hard part because that process piece, how they get from where we are today to that future state, there may be expectations from the leader on what that could look like. But what you're saying is they need to have the ability to have some autonomy there in terms of what that journey looks like. And they're still going to get to that end state, but how they get there may look different than what you or I, as a leader, or anybody in a leadership role might initially envision. But as long as they cast that big picture, it's going to ultimately kind of manifest. And you shared a story with me about how you would train some of the fighter pilots where you kind of you set them up for success, but when it comes to the landing, you were sitting on your hands. And I thought that was such an interesting analogy, so to speak, of how leaders may need to behave in the workplace. So can you share that story with people who are listening and watching so they have an understanding of what I'm talking about, but also maybe can take from that how and what it means to be a leader who's creating that vision and then giving people the ability to do their thing.
Yeah, and a minor correction. It wasn't when I was a fighter pilot. As a fighter pilot, I flew a single seat aircraft, so I'd watch somebody land from another airplane. And I'm like,
Oh gosh.
you can't land it. It's your own skin. But
Oh man.
then I went to general aviation where I'm flying, and I'm sitting right next to or behind or in front of the other pilot or the student pilot.
Got
And
it.
it was hard for me to not say anything. And it was hard for me to learn when to shut up and when to give timely inputs. And so that was a learning
Yeah.
process for me. But ultimately, I learned that I needed to, as they started developing skills and I could see that they were starting to get it, the technical thing, I needed to first move my hands away from the controls, not give any inputs. And then, like you said, actually sit on my hands. And they would see that and their heart rate would go up a little bit because they knew that if
Mm-hmm.
I'm sitting my hands, I can't, immediately jump up and grab the stick in a timely manner. So they were going to have to land the aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes as leaders, we have to do something very visible, very where the person that we're helping or supervising recognizes that we're out of the way, recognizes that it's completely on them. And if they're going to save their own skin, they have to do it. Nobody else is going to help them. And especially you're not going to help them. And so,
Yeah.
it's a learning process as a leader of when do I remove my hands from the stick? When do I just put them in my lap? When do I, no kidding, sit on them? And I would say you have to do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
What I've learned in teaching young students is they're going to learn the best when I get out of their way. They're going to learn the
Right.
best as long as I've taught them the proper techniques and as I've given them enough confidence. The sooner I get them to solo, where I am not in the aircraft at all, and the quicker they're going to learn because they're not waiting for an input from me. They're not waiting for me to say something or to remind them of something. It's completely up to them. And so
Yeah.
a little bit of hyperventilation there and worry, but it's amazing how much more quickly they learn. Like when I teach general aviation, my goal is to get them to solo in less than 10 hours, which is not normal. I would say that. And
Right.
it's because I want them to then fly without me and then they come back and talk about it. They fly without me and then they can learn things and go, man, I almost killed myself, or man, that was kind of dangerous, or oh, that's what he meant when I
Right.
said something beforehand. But they don't have to worry about my inputs. And same thing, like, I taught 5 kids how to drive.
Yeah.
Um, in some ways, that was scarier than landing an
I'm sure.
the real test of trust was when I'd say, okay, sure, you can take my new truck, throw them the keys, and say a quick
Right.
prayer and go have fun with your friends.
Right. Right.
And it didn't turn out well all the time, but for the most part, it did. Now I have 5 relatively good drive, actually really good drivers.
Yeah.
They'll tell me they're better
Well,
than me now, but that's okay.
yeah, right, right. Well, I think another key takeaway here, though, too, is that you are teaching and showing and explaining, and then you're giving people the ability to utilize the information. And I think that's another thing in the workplace that we don't often see enough of sometimes, where the person who is in that leadership role is leading and guiding and explaining and then letting the team. There's often an expectation, here's the vision, but none of the other piece. And part of that, I think, is because you're bringing people onto the team that sometimes they have skills that you don't have, or a knowledge base that you don't have. And so maybe to build on that, how would you're providing a direct transfer of information that you have a body of knowledge of, and the person who is in that flying seat needs and will utilize. How do leaders who have people on their team that they don't necessarily have that skill set or the same level of competency, how do they harness that vision? And you mentioned debriefing earlier. Like, what can they do in that sort of situation when they're leading teams that they may not be as skilled in a certain area, through a business problem, through a change?
Well, that's a great question, because sometimes the leader doesn't have the technical skill. I mean,
Right.
I've supervised a lot of people that were way smarter than me, specifically in what they were doing, but I had been
Mhm.
given the job of supervisor, leader, commander, whatever you want to call it. I had to trust them in their technical skills, which
Mhm.
meant that I had to be even better at providing a vision.
Mhm.
A dangerous thing is when you have a very competent uh, charge subordinate that you haven't given a direction to. That
Mm.
they can wreck a lot of things or go in a direction that you really don't want to go, because you haven't given that direction. That's not a slam on smart people who aren't being given direction. Most people are trying to
Right.
do what's right, but
Yeah.
often that can happen where you get somebody who's very competent, and you leave a vision vacuum, if you will.
Mhm.
The organization can go down a completely different path. So as the supervisor, you really have to set a clear vision of who we are, what we want to accomplish, where do we want to go, and then either by yourself or with them, create very specific objectives that help you get to that vision, that help
Mhm.
you realize that vision. And then every action should be based on those objectives. I want to accomplish a sales goal of this so that we can reach this next level in our company. And so the all of the debrief, all of the discussion, all of the focus needs to be to get to that sales goal. And what it's
Mhm.
going to take to get to that sales goal. And then when you debrief, you don't debrief about the color of the shirt they wore at a presentation. You don't debrief about you debrief, or whether or not they stuttered. You debrief about, did they meet the objectives. Now, some of
Mhm.
the other things about whether or not their shirt mismatched their marketing, those may come out, but that's really not the focus. The focus is, did we meet the objective? And if we did
Yeah.
meet the objective, what is the delta between the objective and where we are right now? And then let's close that gap. For the debrief, you figure out, what do we need to do to close that gap to meet the objective.
How much in the debrief are you providing guidance to the individual, or are you letting them come up with the solutions?
Well, I think it just depends.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. When I was a fighter squadron commander, I couldn't go to every single flight debrief. We
Mhm.
had a mantra of world's greatest close air support. That meant that the guys on the ground, we supported them, and we were going to support them better than anybody else in the world. And we really
Mhm.
believed that, and we trained to it, and my guys knew that. And when I was flying, they saw my example about what I thought was important and how I did that, because I would be involved in my own personal flight debrief. But then I would let the flight leads debrief their own. They knew where we wanted to go. I
Hmm.
trusted them that they were going to do that. And then I would get a sampling by flying with different guys in the squadron to see how we were doing as a whole, as a squadron, in training the new guys, in getting better at specific skills, to where I could say, I think we need an adjustment. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
world's greatest close air support is still the vision, but maybe the objectives we're using about, what our training focus is and how we're spending our hours needs to be adjusted a little bit. But
Got
ultimately,
it.
I would let the team members lead the debriefs.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that makes sense because then they are, again, that comes back to that idea of ownership and creating some ownership on their behalf in the conversation. What other things when you're working with clients, do you recommend or do you sort of from a consulting perspective as it relates to creating that culture? We've talked about vision, the importance of debrief. Are there any other components to that leadership aptitude that we should talk about today?
One thing I did when again, back to my Air Force time when I was a squadron commander, is I, I was relatively new in the job, and I brought all of the officers in one at a time. And if they were married, I brought their wives in, or they were all male pilots in my squadron at the time. So I'd bring their spouses in, and I'd sit down. I'd say, "What do you want to do in the Air Force?" So I'd
Mhm.
get their vision, and
Okay.
so then I could, because I was, as a squadron commander, I was head of HR. I was also the chief trainer. I was also chief evaluator, and then the person who was involved in strategic planning and everything for the squadron. And I couldn't do that effectively and place people effectively if I didn't know where they wanted to go. Because
Yeah.
sometimes I would see talents and skills and say, this guy should be sitting in square A. Well, what if they hated square A and that had nothing to
Right.
their own vision? And so I needed to understand that. So I'd bring them in and I would be very frank with them. I'd say, well, of the 36 pilots in the squadron, you rank number 10, or you rank
Hmm.
number one, or you rank number 36. And so I'd
Hmm.
be very frank with them. And I would say, based on that, these are the kind of jobs, this is where I envision using you in the squadron to grow you. And then this is the kind of assignment, the job you will get out of this squadron at some point. And if they said, well, I don't want to do that, like, okay, what do you want to do? And my job was actually to have 36 happy pilots that were performing
Yeah.
at their optimum. There's always going to be one who's the best, but 36 who are performing at the best and they're sitting on the right, chess square. And because if they're sitting where they should sit and where they want to sit, from a talent perspective and a desire, their own vision, they're going to be a lot more effective. The squadron's going to be a lot more effective. The organization's going to be a lot more effective. And I thought about that a lot as a supervisor outside of the Air Force. So a company brings an employee in, and not every employee works out. Sometimes it's because
Right.
they don't understand your vision, but it's also sometimes because you don't understand their vision.
Right.
Are they there part time as they're working their way through college? In which case, you don't want to move them up too fast. You don't want to put them in certain positions. Maybe so.
Hmm.
Or is it somebody who has severe anxiety about certain positions? I don't care if they're good at it. Don't put them there until you can get them to where they're comfortable. And just understanding the individuals, that will make it easier for them to embrace your vision. If you embrace their vision,
Yeah.
they're going to embrace your vision and they're going to get more excited about it because they feel like they have a home there where they're listened to and they're contributing, not just to execute your selfish desires, but to execute their selfish desires.
Right. Right.
Getting those two things to marry is pretty important.
Yeah. And so you saw that work very well when you were on the, in both settings, it sounds like in the military and the civilian
Yes.
space, where that was I can see that being very valuable, understanding how to best leverage people and then not assuming or putting your own expectations or seeing potential somewhere, but they're not quite ready for it. I think that's a very healthy way of approaching development in individuals and also giving them the opportunity to, you know, uh, really align with the vision because you understand theirs. That's great. That's a really neat way of approaching it.
And I probably learned that from a negative lesson learned because I watched
Yeah.
guys who were, senior to me in the Air Force who were superstars. They were doing really well and they got pushed, pushed, pushed. And they're like,
They burnt out, huh?
I don't want to do that. I just love being in the Air Force. I just want to
Yeah.
serve. And you're trying to turn me into a general, into, the senior leader. when I've got kids in school and I have these things, and
Yeah.
you're making me move every 2 years and 1 year, my desires, my wife's desires, my family's desires are not being met. So
Mm,
I'm out of here, or I'm going to jump off the tracks. And that was a major leadership failure when they could have
yeah.
just sat down and said, "What do you want?
Yeah.
This is how the Air Force can use you, quite frankly. This is how you could succeed in the paradigm of an Air Force career, but what do you want personally? What does your family want personally? And let's see if we can marry the two together." And
Wow. Yeah, that's a hard lesson to learn, but I clearly it stuck with you and it had a positive impact on the other individuals that you worked with. And I think about my own experience of going through burnout and how I just kept climbing the corporate ladder when in reality it wasn't matching what I wanted or was even in a position to be responsible for based on other things just going on in my life. And gosh, if I'd had that conversation with my boss and said, this is what I want right now, that could have been a really healthy way to stay without having to feel like my only option was leaving. So good, again, sorry that you had to have that negative experience, but clearly it turned into a positive one that you're now teaching others about. So that's sort of how we learn, I suppose, right?
yeah,
Sometimes wins and sometimes misses.
yeah, I mean, it's so important because that leader has their own paradigm. I mean, you
Totally.
approach things, I haven't approached the things, and I have a mindset of what right should look like for
Mm-hmm.
me. But my right is not your right. My right is not somebody else's right. So, and I have to recognize that and give that individual a voice and help them to understand uh, that where they want to go is important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And because I need them to perform at max capacity in my organization.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not matching up, and then I'm happy to help them find another job, or I'm happy to help them move into another job, because you'll have a supervisor and they went from a frontline worker to a manager to a director to a VP to now they're sitting as a CEO, and like, well, that's the way you're supposed to do it. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that's a way to do it, but that's not every way to do it. There's some people that are like, I would be really happy spending my entire life as a manager because I don't have to move. I like working at the team level. I mean, there are a
Mm-hmm.
lot of different reasons, and it gives me more time to spend with my kids. Yes, I know I'm giving up money and prestige, but that's not that important to me. And then there will be other people like, I want to be a CEO. Help me get to be a CEO. Okay, we can show you how to do that, and
Yeah.
making sure that the two sets of goals match up.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think that's a really powerful message for people to hear. And another reason why I think it is so powerful is because you're creating that foundation, that baseline for that individual to excel. Because then there's going to be changes and disruption that happen. And so how do they navigate that while they're also performing optimally in their current role? So if you have somebody who's in the wrong role doing the wrong things because it's not their vision, and then you're layering in a bunch of demands and change, then that's really creating the potential for things to not go well, which often happens in organizations. People are misaligned, and then you've got competing priorities, and it ends up being very difficult to navigate. So really wise advice for people who are people leaders to think about asking that question. Well, really first starting with set a very clear vision, and then ask your people, what is their vision for themselves, so you can appropriately align. And everything you've said up to this point, it sounds like when you do those things, you're creating that culture of confident decision makers who can really navigate whatever comes their way. Any other thoughts or advice for people who are listening and watching today's show as it relates to how to build that environment, how to be the best leader you can be, so you can really lead your people and your organization effectively?
One that I think people don't like to hear is everybody should ask themselves, "Am I a micromanager?" Because everybody says, "No, I'm not."
Right.
And yet we all do it to a certain
Yeah.
extent because we don't trust, or we're not sure, we're new in a job,
Yeah.
we're trying to wrap our arms around it. And micromanaging is like the death knell of trust.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to wait. And I know this. I had a boss once who was constantly telling me what to do. And I had this important, title, and I had a good paycheck. And so on paper, I had a great job. And yet I found myself just kind of sitting, waiting to be told what to do because
Right.
I would act with initiative, like, no, don't do it that way. And so asking yourself, am I micromanaging? Am I telling people how to do things? And one way that a lot of leaders micromanage, because they want to know everything, is
Mm-hmm.
they micromanage by questions. They have
Mm,
a preconceived notion of what something should look like and how something should go. And they ask question after question after question until people who are briefing them or, following up with them, they go, okay, what is the boss? How do I need to say it to make the boss happy?
right.
How do I need to say it? And so they're not showing initiative. They're not acting with empowerment, and they're not feeling trusted because the boss is going to do it. One of my favorite quotes, and I'm paraphrasing, but somebody asked General Douglas MacArthur during World War II, "What's your Air Force doing?" And he was in charge of Pacific Air Forces, going into the Philippines, and they're working their way to Japan. He goes, "What's your Air Force doing?" He said, "I don't know. Ask General Kenny."
Mm,
General Kenny was his subordinate. He was in charge of Air Forces, and MacArthur had given him charge of the Air Forces.
mm.
Like, go ask Kenny what the Air Force is doing. He's in charge. And so even though MacArthur was in charge, that was a great statement of that's that's my subordinate. That's his job to handle. And
Yeah.
and I've seen a lot of workers are like, well, let me find out. And they would have gone and asked their charge, hundreds and thousands of questions. What are you doing? So that they can stand up in front of the press or the Congress, or in that case,
Yeah.
just their next boss, and say, well, they're doing this and this and this and this, and this is our timeline. Like they're have a full handle on it. And sometimes it's very empowering as a leader to, again, know what your vision is, know what your objectives that you're shooting for, know how you're doing in relation to those objectives. But other than that, stay away from the details.
Mm,
Let
mm-hmm.
them manage the details. Let them come into your office and sound smarter than you, because they probably,
Mm.
and so
Yeah.
let that happen. And they'll go, the boss really needs me. The boss
Yeah.
really needs me because he or she doesn't understand this stuff as
Yeah.
I understand that stuff. All they want to know is that it's a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and how am I helping it be a thumbs up?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I can see how that's very empowering. As you were describing that though too, I thought, well, is there also the off chance where the individual who is sharing that information ever feels like, oh God, I know more than this person. That's a problem. Because I can see that happening too. But that's just maybe a rookie leadership move on my part. Have
Let
you
me
run
give,
into that?
let me give you an example. I flew airplanes for a living, and I never once fixed an airplane. So
There you
your
go.
chief, a mechanic would say, "This is what's broken.
Yeah.
This is what's broken, and this is what it's going to take to fix it." And while I may push him on the timeline of can we fix it sooner, I had to rely on him because I was completely ignorant about how to fix that airplane.
Totally.
I
Yeah.
was not going to do that. And there was a sense of empowerment of them knowing that I was ignorant, and that them knowing that I still had requirements, mission requirements. I still had a desire to meet the vision of the mission, but he was the expert, or she was the expert,
Yeah.
how we were going to do that in terms of getting the aircraft ready to go. And I just needed to stay out of their way and provide them the resources that they needed so that they could do their job.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I often feel that way when I take my car to the mechanic too. I'm like, what do we need to do here? And I have no idea. And trusting that they can tell me what to do. Not the same sort of example, but at any rate, Derek, this has been a lot of fun talking to you. You've got a wealth of wisdom, obviously, and I'm excited for your next book to come out. And what is the name of that book? Do you have the working title yet, or is it still in development?
It's going to be The Confident Leader.
A confident leader. Perfect. I love it. Well, good luck with continuing to write that. And then for those that are watching, listening, Rising Above is a book that he's already written with his father, which is really cool. I was able to go through it and you have a lot of detail and stories and like examples of what you and him have done in your career and how it's applicable to, developing confidence as a leader already. So it's a really great book to check out. And where can people find you if they're interested in working with you and having you come speak to their teams, do a little consulting? What's the best way to get in touch?
You can reach the book. You can find on Amazon. The book you can
Mhm.
also find on my website, That's DerekOaks.com,
Got it.
DerekOaks.com.
Perfect.
And there you can direct message me. You can reach me on LinkedIn at
Cool.
just look for Derek Oaks on LinkedIn. You'll find me, and then direct message me there. You go to the website, and it'll link you up to my email and phone number, and I'd be happy to talk and see if I'm a fit for your organization, if I can help. What I found is that big or small organizations, uh, very few of them don't suffer from a lack of vision of where we're.
Yeah.
Very few companies are like Apple. I mean, Apple had this is who we are and this is where we're going.
Hmm.
Everybody knows what does Apple kind of stand for in terms of how they approach making customers happy.
Hmm.
Most companies kind of hunt and peck around. They're trying to make money, trying to keep, stay in the black. And so that they often get away from their initially stated vision, or
Yeah.
they never stated a vision. Or if you have a small company, it's your baby and you're not sure you want to trust your workers fully with your baby, but
Yeah.
you want to grow, you have to. And so how do I do that? And so I would say that the size of the organization really doesn't matter. You have to ask yourself do we have a vision? Do people understand the vision? And then are we meeting that vision? If not, then I'd be happy to help you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for your time. I hope this brings you people and teams that could benefit from your services. And thanks again for sharing your time and wisdom with the Change Leader Insights community. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Have a good one.